So, welcome to our third summer speaker program. My name is Mike Barkey. I'm the Executive Director of the Door County Environmental Council. Before we begin our program tonight, I'd like to make some introductory remarks, tell you a little bit about the council, a little bit about the work we do, thank some of our sponsors that provide some grant money for us to put these programs on, and then introduce our speaker who's been very patient. For over 50 years, the DCEC has been working to preserve and protect our fragile Door County environment. We collaborate with many other environmental groups, including the Climate Change Coalition, Kewanee Cares, and the Door County Public Library, among others. Our current focus right now is on Door County surface water. As you may know, Door County has 300 miles of shoreline and upwards of 39 inland lakes. There are also 24 streams in Door County. However, according to the most recent Wisconsin DNR Water Quality Report, at least 10 county streams, Door County streams, and the Bay of Green Bay are impaired or polluted. Contaminants include PCBs, E. coli, and phosphorus, among others. Last year in 2023, there were 37 beach advisories and 20 beach closures in Door County due to elevated E. coli levels. Last year, beach water quality monitors were installed at 5 Door County beaches, and this summer, an additional 5 more monitors hopefully will be installed. Last year, we worked with UW-Oshkosh Professor Greg Kleinheinz and his team to monitor water quality at more Door County beaches and to monitor more frequently. As you may know, there is also growing concern over the elevated levels of phosphorus in our surface waters. Consequently, this summer, we are again working with Professor Kleinheinz, this time to monitor phosphorus levels in the water and in the sediment at 7 Door County locations. We would like to thank the following for supporting our summer speaker programs: Destination Door County, the Door County Community Foundation, the Door County Green Fund, the Raymond F. and Eleanor A. Pesch Charitable Fund, and the Shannon Moore and Ron Kropp Charitable Fund. So if you can help us, also help us to protect our Door County surface waters, we would be greatly appreciated. Now, I'm pleased to welcome Gina LaLiberte, who leads response and communication on cyanobacterial bloom issues as a statewide harmful algal bloom coordinator for the Wisconsin DNR. Gina has a BS in biology and an MS in resource ecology management from the University of Michigan. She has studied algae for over 30 years and is a lifelong resident of the Great Lakes region. So let's please welcome Gina and thank her for her patience. Gina?
All right, well, great. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here with you tonight. And hopefully this works okay with the paging through. So I just want to introduce some terms I'm going to be using in this talk. We are talking about algae, but algae really is an artificial group of organisms. It encompasses everything from giant kelp growing off the coast of California down to absolutely minuscule single-celled bacteria. They're all lumped under this mantle of algae because they're photosynthetic organisms. They have chlorophyll, they go through photosynthesis. So algae is really sort of a really mixed group of organisms. I'm going to be talking later on tonight about cyanobacteria. When I talk about that, that is more commonly known as blue-green algae. It's the exact same thing. It's just a more scientific term. And cyanobacteria are actually true bacteria. So they're single-celled organisms that can only reproduce through cell division. And then later on when I talk about cyanobacterial blooms, that is a nuisance level of cyanobacteria. There isn't actually any sort of official quantification of what makes an accumulation of cyanobacteria a bloom, but they tend to be noticeable, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. So to introduce myself, this picture on the left is something one of my coworkers' kids drew of me. She was in the lab for a day, and I found a microscope for her to look at stuff, and I do love algae, and they're so cool. I have a whole fleet of microscopes at home, and there's such cool things to see under the scope, but unfortunately, most people's impressions of algae are what you see in the Wordle on the right. Algae, it's gross, it's wrong, and it's kind of a mixed bag for me to come and talk to folks about the bad sorts of algae, but I'm going to start out with sort of the good things. So how many of you have actually thanked a cyanobacterium today? None of you. I haven't either, but we should, because cyanobacteria are the reason why we're breathing oxygen today. They were the first photosynthetic organisms on Earth, and about 2 to 2.5 billion years ago, they really started growing like crazy in these stromatolites, which you see in the photo on the right. This is Shark Bay in Western Australia. These are living stromatolites, and what stromatolites are, they're accumulations of cyanobacteria that kind of grow in layers. They were photosynthesizing like crazy, putting out oxygen, and they converted, billions of years ago, our atmosphere from one that was methane-based to one that's oxygen-based. So they're why we're breathing oxygen today. So on the upper left, you can see what a fossil stromatolite looks like. You see a lot of different layers in there. And they're actually fossil stromatolites in this region. That red slab is actually a cut through what's called the Virginia mine jasper. It's from St. Louis County in Minnesota. So those round things are stromatolites that actually grew in the Great Lakes region before we had Great Lakes. So we can thank cyanobacteria today for the oxygen we're breathing. And another reason we should be really thankful for algae, just all algae, is all of them go through photosynthesis, produce the oxygen that we breathe today, and food. They're the base of the food web in aquatic systems. These are pictures of diatoms, sort of that brownish film that you see on the left is a film of diatoms. It's photosynthesizing like crazy, and those are bubbles of oxygen that it's producing. So diatoms grow in both freshwater and marine systems, and I believe they're responsible for somewhere between 20 and 30% of oxygen production on Earth. So really significant producers of oxygen. The other reason they're really important is they're excellent food sources. You can see, I don't know if you can, yeah, you can sort of see my cursor, I think. Is that visible up there? All right, so these blobs in here, so diatoms are single-celled algae. This is actually a silica cell wall. They're really cool to look at under the microscope, but they're really important for aquatic food webs because they make long-chain fatty acids that kind of form these little sort of oil globules inside. So they're really nutrient-rich sources of food for aquatic organisms. It's sort of like they're the cheese curds out there. They're really filling for aquatic organisms. They eat these, they're going to keep going a while, more so than if they're eating sort of green algae, which are more like lettuce, I guess. So oxygen, food, very important. That's why we should like algae and appreciate them. But there are issues with algae. So I'm going to talk now about issues with Cladophora in Lake Michigan. This may be sort of a familiar sight to some of you, accumulations of Cladophora on a beach. And what Cladophora is, it is a green alga that is filamentous, so it grows in long strands that are branched. And typically we see it growing on hard surfaces at the margins of Great Lakes, out on the bottom on hard surfaces. We see it in rivers and inland lakes as well. And all of this green stuff that you see on this riprap is Cladophora. And this is what it looks like in the center. Can grow in long strands. You can see how fluffy it is from the numerous branches. And Cladophora is really ecologically important because all of these fluffy strands can support the growth of, hey, diatoms. All these little brown specks on these filaments are diatoms. So they're a really important refuge for small aquatic organisms. You have this great place to live that's protected from other things eating you. You've got this marvelous food source right there. It's really useful. But Cladophora has grown to be an issue in recent years, in part because of these guys. So first, zebra mussels were the invasive mussels dominant in Lake Michigan. They've almost now completely been taken over by what these are. These are quagga mussels. And zebra mussels were limited to growing on hard surfaces. Quagga mussels aren't. They can grow on soft sediments. They kind of form balls growing on each other like this. They can grow, they're actually growing all the way out in the middle of Lake Michigan. They have completely changed the ecology of Lake Michigan. And you can see there's some green stuff growing on those shells. And what zebra mussels and now quagga mussels are doing is they're essentially farming Cladophora in Lake Michigan. So what do they offer Cladophora? They have a hard surface. You can see all of these strands are Cladophora filaments that are growing on them, and this fluffy brown stuff is more diatoms that make sort of stalk material that they grow on. So they have a hard surface. The reason we're seeing a lot more Cladophora is these quagga mussels are filter feeders, and what they've done is they filter feed the water. They have basically taken a lot of the phytoplankton, the other algae that grow floating in the water column. They have taken that out. They've made the lake a lot clearer. So if any of you used to say scuba dive around here 20 or 30 years ago, the visibility was a lot less. Thanks to these guys, you can see really well now in the lake, but that also means there's a lot more sunlight reaching the Cladophora on the bottom. So they have a surface to grow Cladophora. They have essentially turned on the grow lights by clearing out the water column, so more sunlight's reaching more of the bottom. The other thing is they're excreting phosphorus really close to the bottom. Used to be in Lake Michigan, we would have phosphorus in the water in the spring. There'd be a big diatom bloom in the sort of planktonic diatom bloom. The planktonic diatoms would die, they'd settle onto the bottom. There were small sort of shrimp-like creatures that would eat that, and that was a really important food source for lake whitefish. That has completely changed because we don't really have those diatom blooms as much in the spring anymore. These guys have eaten everything, they've stripped them out of the water column, and then they excrete phosphorus and nitrogen really close to the bottom. So essentially making this little loop on the bottom, and that's why we've seen so much more Cladophora in recent years. It's because of these zebra mussels and quagga mussels. And this is the end result. You get a lot of those long strands of Cladophora growing on a shell. If you have a storm event, all that long stuff on your shell creates a lot more drag, so it's easier for the Cladophora to get ripped off and washed into shore. It also, as part of its natural life cycle, kind of goes through a sloughing period in late summer, so that's part of this as well. But there's a lot more Cladophora because of those mussels. And unfortunately, this creates some issues for water quality at beaches too, because you end up with a lot of bacteria in these Cladophora mats that wash on shore. Think about it, you're not just having Cladophora wash in, we've got the mussels in there too. Seagulls and other birds like to go forage in those mats. They're picking out those mussels, they're eating them, they're pooping on those mats, and those dark mats, they're in the sun, they're nice and warm, they're basically acting as incubators, and you can grow a lot of bacteria. So that's one of the big downsides to having these mats wash on shore. Where they end up depends a lot on currents and waves, so they can wash in one day and wash out the next day if you've got a storm, say, coming through and washing it around. So it can be sort of sporadic, but a really significant issue for beach water quality when these mats are washed up on shore. And there's been some work in northern Lake Michigan looking at how water levels relate to it, and how water levels relate to this. We tend to have less Cladophora growing when we've got high water levels. So up here on the upper left, the water's high. We have this lighthouse sort of as a marker for depth in the lake. You aren't in this sort of shallow nearshore area. You're not getting as much sunlight, reaching as much area, so you've got less Cladophora growing in those high water years. Low water years, though, you've got maybe more of that nearshore shelf is getting a lot of sunlight. There's more area for Cladophora to grow, and that's when you really see this increase in the shoreline fouling. More Cladophora is growing. So I want to say 2019, 2020 were really high water level years. 2022, I got a complaint from northern Green Bay from this person who'd lived there for 5 years, had never seen this before, and wasn't convinced that this was stuff that was washing in from the lake until we finally were able to convince her of this. But I mean, that she was seeing this in one of these reduced water years, and there was just a lot of Cladophora out there, and unfortunately for her, where her shoreline was, it was basically poised to catch everything that was coming up the bay. So again, those shoreline fouling events really start to increase when the lake levels drop. You got more light reaching the bottom and more area for Cladophora to grow. And there's one other unfortunate effect of Cladophora. We've got a lot of Cladophora growing in these mussel beds out in the lake. You've got decomposed material that's in there, and the water's really warm. You can have low oxygen level down there, and that is basically perfect conditions for Clostridium bacteria to grow. And Clostridium is able to make the toxin botulinum. So the same stuff that's in Botox, but if you're an animal, you eat it. We tend to have, botulism strain E. It affects a lot of these diving birds, so loons, mergansers, other diving ducks that are going down to the bottom, either eating mussels or small fish that have maybe eaten some of this material that's contaminated with botulinum toxin, and they die, unfortunately, and they wash up on beaches. So this tends to happen more towards fall migration. The water's warmer. Those are the conditions when you tend to see more of the botulinum toxin being produced out in these Cladophora and mussel beds, and that's when we see the migrating birds dying and washing up on the beaches. But be very careful if you're out on the beach. You see the dead birds. There are other diseases that you could accidentally pick up if you're handling the birds with your bare hands, so don't do that, but definitely keep your dogs away from them. You don't want your dogs eating either dead birds or dead fish on the shore if you don't know if that animal died from botulinum toxin. So that is one of the very unfortunate downsides of Cladophora. So now I'm going to switch to another fun topic, harmful cyanobacterial blooms. I started at least out with the nice algae stuff, what they do for us. But we'll talk now about cyanobacterial blooms. So again, talking about cyanobacteria, I'm talking about blue-green algae. And a bloom is just when you have growth of cyanobacteria to high concentrations that you can see in the water. So I mostly work on cyanobacterial blooms in inland lakes, and this is sort of a typical view of what a cyanobacterial bloom looks like in an inland lake. Lots of these little tiny green flecks floating near the surface of that lake. And something I really want to emphasize is that cyanobacteria are everywhere. They're in every aquatic habitat. There are even some in terrestrial habitats I'll talk about in a little bit. So this is cyanobacteria growing in a mud puddle. Very temporary, but hey, there was enough water in there long enough, they started taking off and growing. This is a little bit of peek at a cyanobacterial bloom that's planktonic, so free-floating in the water, accumulated near shore. These mats are benthic cyanobacteria. Benthic means they grow on the bottom of aquatic systems. So this is in a creek, and sometimes they lift up off the bottom and float. And I'll show you more pictures of what these look like later. But cyanobacterial blooms are not anything new. So I talked about cyanobacteria basically changing our atmosphere from one that's methane-based to oxygen-based. So they've been around for billions of years, but we've been looking at blooms for a long time too. And I don't know how I'm going to celebrate this, but this September 7th is going to mark 350 years since Antony van Leeuwenhoek used his microscope and looked at a drop of pond water and saw what he described as earthy particles and green streaks and animalcules. And people have figured out that he was looking at a cyanobacterial bloom in a Dutch pond in 1674. So blooms have been around for a long time. And in Wisconsin, the earliest record that I've seen of a bloom is from the late 1800s in Lake Mendota in Madison. So they've been around for a while. I don't know. So put this on your calendar. It's going to be fabulous. So talking more about what cyanobacterial blooms look like. So these are planktonic blooms. So again, cyanobacteria that grow free-floating in the water. And their blooms tend to look like spilled paint and pea soup. So these two photos in the middle and on the left, there's no wind or waves. So planktonic cyanobacteria are buoyant. So when you've got no wind or waves, they're able to float to the surface of the water and form what looks like slicks of spilled paint on the surface. When you've got more waves, that mixes into the water and it tends to look more like pea soup, as in this photo on the right. And so cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, these are all looking green. You may wonder, well, where's the blue in that? I'll talk about that in a minute. But when blooms are actively growing, the most common species tend to be green. So cyanobacterial blooms can have a lot of different unusual colors. So anytime you see sort of weird colored water that has a scum or mats or It's colored because there's just tons, trillions of tiny particles in the water. Be really suspicious that that's cyanobacteria. So often you won't see the blue that puts the blue into blue-green algae until you have a bloom that starts to break down and decompose. And here you see sort of a turquoise streak along the shoreline. And that's because this is a blue pigment that's normally masked by green chlorophyll. Not until those cells die and break open and that really fragile chlorophyll molecule then immediately decomposes. That's when you see that blue pigment, and that's when you see sort of these turquoisey streaks along shorelines and surfaces. Decomposing blooms can have other colors too, sort of whitish, mint green sometimes. Here's a nice white bloom. But actively growing cyanobacteria can have other colors too. So here's a couple of sort of purplish ones in the upper left. Another kind of lavender-looking bloom that's breaking down. But there are also some that are sort of brownish, as you see in the upper right here. So really unusual colors. And the way people describe them to me is always very interesting too. So this is a big decomposing bloom in the marina at High Cliff State Park, so in Lake Winnebago, which has a lot of bloom issues. So you can see blooms described as looking like spilled paint. It's been described to me as looking like antifreeze, floral foam, so those little green foam blocks that people use for like flower arrangements. So I'll talk about that in a second. But this is my favorite. Someone dumped a porta potty, and it was a decomposing bloom. There was a lot of blue in the water, and that person was convinced that blue couldn't possibly be from any natural source. It had to be an unnatural source. So our spills team does often get spills reports from especially the Fox River that gets a lot of bloom material coming down from Lake Winnebago, and they're weird colors, and people are just convinced it has to be a chemical that someone illegally dumped. But no, unfortunately, it's a big bloom that's decomposing. So I also talked about benthic, or the bottom-dwelling cyanobacterial mats. So these are some pictures of that. So these guys tend to live in water that's really clear. They're living on the bottom. They need the sun for photosynthesis, so they have to have clear water for the sun to reach them on the bottom. So here in the upper left, you can see sort of some dark brown mats. This is sort of the floral foam looking stuff. There's some really vividly kind of teal colored mats that I especially get reports in northern Wisconsin lakes around this time of year. So these guys float up off the bottom. There's some that are sort of purple, so these are purple mats or some cyanobacteria mats, and all that green stuff around it is duckweed. And then this is actually a photo I took. This was a vacation photo in the marina at Sturgeon Bay a few years ago, and here's a lovely cyanobacterial mat. You can sort of see the little fluffy edges. All of those little dark hair-like things are filaments of cyanobacteria, and I can tell it floated up off the bottom because there's some bottom sediments that it was hiding under, and then it just lifted up off the bottom. So basically, these guys are on the bottom, they're happy, they're photosynthesizing, they make a lot of oxygen, it gets caught in their mats, and it buoys them to the top. So that's when you see these guys floating. And again, these types of benthic or bottom-dwelling cyanobacteria need really clear water for their growth. So these are some great pictures with super clear water. Here's some really weird-looking dark-colored mats of cyanobacteria that probably lifted up off the bottom along with this mat of filamentous green algae here. On the right, this is sort of that floral foam-looking stuff. It's a really vivid teal color. It's really eye-catching, and I can see why someone thought it was floral foam. It looked like someone got rid of their floral arrangement, threw it in the lake, and then it floated inshore, but this is actually cyanobacteria. And one other thing that's really cool about these benthic mats, at least I think it's really cool, is they're motile. So they can move. They don't just sit there, they can actually actively move. And so this is a jar that had a benthic mat in it, and also a little bit of filamentous green algae that was sort of stringy. And these guys, I shook it up, let it sit for a while, and the benthic cyanobacteria actually crawled up the strands of filamentous green algae. You can see a little bit floating here too, but it's it's really kind of cool to see them. It's really frustrating to try to take a picture of them with the microscope too, because they keep moving and turning. It's just like, stop, I want to get your picture, but they don't cooperate. They just keep moving. So I'm going to run through a few other types of cyanobacteria. So there are colonial cyanobacteria, so cells that kind of grow in a colony. And these again are growing on the bottoms of aquatic systems, usually inland lakes. So Aphanithesis stagnina grows in sort of these little ball-shaped colonies. You can sort of see some on the bottom of the lake here. This is what they look like under the microscope. And these have a texture that's kind of soft enough to pinch through with your fingers. And contrast that with nostoc. So this is my favorite cyanobacteria genus. I actually have a favorite. So if you have ever seen what looks like little mint green colored tapioca pearls bobbing at the side of a pond, or a lake, that's what this is. This is nostoc. So they have a big range in size. They can be microscopic. Quite often they're sort of pinhead sized to BB sized, but there are also some that are really big. This is Nostoc pruniforme. This can grow to be like egg sized. They call them lake plums in the Scandinavian countries. And again, these guys are living on the bottom. They have to have really clear water. This species especially likes really clear water, and it kind of grows in collaboration with some really short aquatic plant species, because it can't survive if it gets shaded out either by tall plants. So if, say, Eurasian water milfoil moved in, these guys, they'd be shaded out, and phytoplankton as well. And then if any of you live on Kangaroo Lake and you've seen green blobs floating around, do not be afraid. This is not cyanobacteria. This is actually a protozoan that contains a symbiotic green alga. So these soft little blobs are Ophidium colonies. So in case anyone here or online is from Kangaroo Lake and thought, oh no, I've seen giant nostoc balls in my lake. No, you haven't. It's Ophidium, it's a protozoan, it's okay. Not an issue. And then finally, I talked about some cyanobacteria live on land, and this is one of them. And this is another lovely vacation photo from Door County. So Nostoc commune. Normally, when it's dried up and desiccated, it kind of looks like just little black crinkly things. I was actually looking out in the gravel at the side of the parking lot for it. I didn't spend a lot of time, but I'm sure it's out there. I can feel it. But it doesn't really look like much. It's not really noticeable. And it has common names, so really old common names of star jelly. The French call it crachette de lune, so moon loogies. And that's because overnight, if you have a really dewy evening or if it's been raining, this stuff turns into sort of this green rubbery mess in the morning, and that's what you see. And it really looked like something that appeared overnight that fell from the stars or the moon or whatever. So this is Nostoc commune. It lives on land. And it grows right here in Door County. So that was a lot of the cyanobacteria, different types, what they look like. So now I'm going to talk more about back to the planktonic blooms, which really tend to be more of the issue in inland lakes and Great Lakes as well, and what makes blooms grow. And it's an interaction of different chemical, physical, and biological conditions. I'm going to go through those in a minute. And overlying that is time and climate change. But I really want to emphasize, when it comes to individual lake systems, every lake is going to respond differently. There's going to be different conditions in each lake. So while I might talk in broad generalities about what causes blooms in a specific water body is going to be specific to conditions in that particular water body. I'm picking on Minnesota right now, so here are lakes side by side. This one has a cyanobacterial bloom, this one doesn't. So they're right next to each other. You could probably, you might throw a baseball across, I'm not sure, but really close to each other, yet completely different. So when it comes to cyanobacterial blooms, the causes of them, we really focus on those chemical causes. So nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen that can fertilize their growth. And both phosphorus and nitrogen matter. Phosphorus is more the limiting nutrient in aquatic systems, but we've done a darn good job of adding it to our aquatic systems. But nitrogen is really important too, especially when it comes to cyanobacterial toxins. So some cyanobacteria can actually make toxins. Those that do don't make them all the time, and we don't quite know what triggers them to make them. But microcystin is probably the most commonly produced cyanobacterial toxin that we find in Wisconsin lakes and rivers and wetlands. And it's a really nitrogen-rich molecule. So if you have a lot of nitrogen in the system, it's very possible that cyanobacteria, if they're a bloom, especially if they're a species and a strain that can produce microcystin, if something happens, if they have available nitrogen, they can make that toxin molecule. And then just like us, there are other micronutrients that are essentially like vitamins. So things like iron that they need for different cellular processes are important too. And then when it comes to when you're getting those nutrients, we do see blooms following inputs like heavy rainstorms, but those inputs don't always precede blooms. Depending on the water body, you might have what's called internal loading from the sediments. In some lakes, you will have a big store of phosphorus in the sediments, and if you have chemical conditions down at the bottom that reduce oxygen, you can have chemical reactions going on in the sediments that make that phosphorus into a form that's available for use by algae. And then if you have something happening, like a big storm that stirs up sediments, or if it's just a shallow lake anyway that's going to get mixed by either heavy winds or by boat traffic or whatever, you can get those nutrients coming right back up into the water column from the bottom and being made available for growth by cyanobacteria or other algae or even plants too. Inland lakes especially, leaky septic systems can be a source of nutrients to the lake. So that's why you have to be very careful. If you have a septic system on a lake, it has to be sited properly, has to be the right size for the number of people using that house, and has to be maintained properly too. And this can really be an issue in lakes when you have high water levels, as we've seen over multiple years in northern Wisconsin. You get high water levels. If you've got a septic system that's too low, you can actually get a connection between the lake and that septic system via groundwater. So you have to be very careful about maintaining and siting and sizing properly too. And then I'll talk about physical causes in a second. So there are other chemicals in lakes that can affect whether blooms are able to succeed or not. So salt is one of them. So road salt runoff, it's bad for many, many aquatic organisms. A lot of the more desirable kinds of algae, they don't do very well with a lot of salt in the water, but cyanobacteria tend to be able to resist it, and they can still grow. So salt might knock out the competition, but cyanobacteria are still there. The same is true of herbicides. So whether it's land-applied herbicides that are being washed into a lake, or if it's herbicides that are being applied to treat aquatic nuisance growths of aquatic plants, those might be knocking out your more desirable kinds of algae, and again, cyanobacteria are resistant. So in both of these cases, you're knocking out the competition, and you might be allowing cyanobacteria to grow a little bit better. And then when it comes to physical causes, I talked about this a little bit earlier. So when you've got those low to no wind conditions, that's when you typically see scums floating to the surface. But it's really important to recognize that wind plays a role too. So if you've got that floating scum, it can be blown to the downwind shore. So here we've got some big blooms in this very enhanced satellite image of Mendota and Monona and Madison. Here you can tell that the wind's blowing from the southwest here. So it's blowing those blooms up against that northeast shore. You probably have pea soup conditions here and very clear conditions here in the upwind direction. So blooms can be really patchy in space and time because of the floating and effects of wind. And even if you have a lake that doesn't typically have blooms, it's got great water quality, there's always going to be at least some cyanobacteria in there. And I've had people calling me when they have this beautiful lake, they've never had a bloom issue, and all of a sudden a bloom appears at their shoreline. And I kind of walk back through and I'm like, okay, what's the weather been like? It's been dead calm for 3 days, so everything floats to the surface, and then you've had gentle wind coming to your shore for a day or two, and everything ends up at their shoreline. So you have to really consider some of these physical things like wind too. And then biological impacts can be important. Talking here about biological impacts of different invasive species. So I already talked about like zebra mussels and quagga mussels and Cladophora. There's been some work in inland lakes in Michigan that shows that even in lakes that have low to moderate nutrients, zebra mussels can help to basically foster the growth of cyanobacterial blooms. So again, they're filter feeders, they're taking everything out of the water, and they're ingesting the good stuff, and they can spit out the cyanobacteria. But since those planktonic cyanobacteria are buoyant, they don't just sit on the bottom and go, oh, woe is me, I'm gonna die. They're buoyant. They just, okay, let's go up to the surface and get some sun, and they do, and that's how you can get more cyanobacterial blooms, even in systems that have kind of low nutrients. You can have indirect effects through the food web. So this is Bithotrephes, a spiny water flea. We've got it in Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, and some inland lakes in Wisconsin. And it's a predator, and it likes to eat these guys. These are Daphnia. They're basically like little cows that eat a lot of the other algae. They'll eat cyanobacteria too. But if this guy is eating a lot of your Daphnia, you're taking out a lot of the guys who would basically munch down the excess cyanobacteria in your system. And then carp can be a big issue too. So what carp do, they keep aquatic plants from growing, so the sediments aren't being held in place, and they're kind of rooting around in the sediments. You get sediments and those nutrients mixed up in the water. This is a picture from a study about 15 years ago on Lake Wingra in Madison. Scientists put a big enclosure around here. They took all the carp out, and you can clearly see there's a bloom outside in the lake, lovely clear water inside with lots of aquatic plants. So that really demonstrated what carp are doing. And then they tagged some carp. They did a big netting project to get rid of them, and it really helped the water quality in this lake. But it was a small lake, so it was at a scale they could actually do that. And I also talked about time and climate change. So unfortunately, a lot of the changes we're actually seeing in Wisconsin from climate change are gonna make our waters more favorable for cyanobacterial blooms. So this is a diagram from the Wiki Project, Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts. I think that's the acronym. It's based at UW-Madison, and a lot of people at DNR work on that as well. So these are actually changes this is the mean temperature, so average temperatures that we've already seen. So from 1950 to 2018, these are changes we've already documented. So they've split Wisconsin into different regions, and each of those stars means you've got a significant trend. So scientifically demonstrated trends in warmer average temperatures. That also translates into warmer water temperatures. Cyanobacteria grow a lot better in warmer water temperatures than other kinds of desirable algae, so those warmer temperatures are going to help blooms to grow. And those warmer temperatures over time, like we've seen this year, means we've got a lot shorter ice-on season on lakes. And what that does, when you've got that longer ice-free season, usually, I'll say in a normal year, you've got a period of ice, the cyanobacteria kind of die off under the ice over the winter. There's no light reaching them, etc. And then it takes a while for the ice to melt in the spring. When you've got years like we just had where they kept growing for a long time, maybe even into January, and then maybe there was a month or two of ice, and then it melted, and then it gives them a jump start. They don't die off. They can start growing earlier in the spring than they could in a more normal year. So those longer growing seasons are going to have an effect too. And then, of course, heavy rains and snow melt, those big runoff events are going to bring extra nutrients in. And again, this is a change in annual precipitation that from the Wiki project, and at least we've got significant trends in southern Wisconsin from 1950 to 2018. So we are seeing significant increases in our annual precipitation, and a lot of that's coming in these heavier rain events. So 1, 2, 3 inches of rain in a single rain event, and that's going to bring a lot of nutrients into systems. And then we do have, talking about some tools that we have. Made that noise. So NOAA's Coastal Science product for Lower Green Bay and Lake Winnebago. Basically, we're using satellite remote sensing to detect blooms in these water bodies. I've got the color image covered up, but basically in these pictures, the hotter the color, the more intense that bloom is. So right here around 100,000 cells, it's sort of a bluish green color, and then moving up into yellow and red, you get more and more cyanobacteria are present as detected with this satellite system. About 100,000 is where you can have scums start to form, and then you really have thick scums here when it gets into red. It might be mixed into the water here in Green Bay. So this is what it looked like yesterday. And we've got some additional products from US EPA's cyan, was it the Cyan project? So you can get a picture of the whole of Wisconsin. They actually produce this for all of the continental United States and Alaska. And I'm going to zoom in because we can see, so July 31st, there was a really intense bloom on Lake Winnebago. Guess what direction the wind was blowing? From the southwest. So it was all getting stuck up here on the north and east shore. A little bit of a bloom here. But something I want to point out in this image. So this particular product is good for accurate detection of blooms in about 130 of Wisconsin's largest water bodies. It doesn't work yet on small water bodies just because of the pixel sizes, but that's in the works. In a few years we'll get that. But I want to point out a few things. Where we tend to see the most blooms are these large riverine impoundments. So this is a Big O Plain Reservoir, Petenwell and Castle Rock on the Wisconsin River. This is Beaver Dam Lake, a really shallow impoundment in Dodge County. It's surrounded by agricultural fields. It's about, I think the average depth is something like 8 feet deep or something. It's what's called hypereutrophic, so it's like at the top of nutrient level. Really intense blooms in these systems. So impoundments, shallow impoundments especially, tend to be where we see the most blooms. But I also want to point out, you're seeing some color here in sort of northeast Wisconsin and some to the northwest too. So we do see some blooms in the north. People kind of have this idea that you go north of Highway 8 and there won't be any blooms, but it depends on the water body. Once again, there are some that are going to have blooms. And then talking about safety around cyanobacterial blooms. So because cyanobacteria can make toxins, you can be exposed by ingesting them in water, by inhaling them in water droplets. So if you're, say, tubing or water skiing across a lake with a bloom, or some people have skin reactions too if they're rubbed on their skin after clothing. And the toxins aren't absorbed through your skin, it's just strictly a dermal reaction. But you can have illnesses if you're ingesting them or inhaling them. So I guess one of the good things about cyanobacterial blooms is you can see the ones that are of highest concern. If you see a lot in the water, that's really when you need to take precautions. So you've got those surface scums like you see here, or that pea soup water, you've got really high concentrations of cyanobacteria. If they're producing toxins, and you can't tell by just looking at them, but if you see that, and they are, you're going to possibly be at risk for illness if you are ingesting that water. Things like these floating benthic mats, they tend to be big and noticeable, so you can really avoid them. When you've got more of this fine dust on the surface, like on the lower right, that might be more of judgment call, but you also have to think about the vulnerabilities of the person who might be going in the water. If you're an adult who's wading, maybe not a problem. You don't think you're going to wipe out and go underwater. But if you're an 18-month-old, you want to keep them out of this water because they're going to put their face in the water, they're going to touch it with their hands, they're going to put their fingers in their mouth, they're going to be exposed. Same with dogs too. So just always remember, I'm No fun at the beach, because I've seen the stuff under the microscope. Water is never 100% safe. There's always going to be other bacteria, viruses, and parasites that might be present. And you want to keep them out of your mouth, because that's the best thing you can do. So just simple practices for water safety. Learn what to look for when there's no testing or signage. DNR doesn't have funding to test for blue-green algae at our state properties. Outside of those DNR properties, that jurisdiction falls to your local health departments, and for the most part in Wisconsin, they just don't have the funding or the staffing. Think about like Oneida County that has hundreds of lakes. You'd have to have a lot of people on staff to test those on a regular basis. And just use common sense. If the water looks questionable, yeah, your gut's telling you, stay out. It is questionable, so trust your gut on that. If you see a lot of particles in the water, avoid submerging your head, because you could have a lot of bacteria associated with that. It doesn't have to be cyanobacteria. But if you see a lot of particles, keep little kids and pets out. When it comes to kids and pets, choose the clearest water possible for them, and always avoid swimming in really shallow, warm, stagnant water bodies. There are other things that could be present too that could be harmful as well. Shower off after swimming in any surface water body, and above all, just keep water out of your mouth. It's going to protect you from those other things that I see under the microscope and you don't want to ingest. Trust me, you don't. Giardia, no one wants Giardia. It could be in there though, so keep it out of your mouth. And then when it comes to pets, please supervise them. We have unfortunately had pet deaths from exposure to cyanobacteria. In the past, I worked with my colleagues at Department of Health Services in investigating these illnesses and deaths, and it's really, really awful to talk to someone whose dog has just died because they're exposed to cyanobacteria and they didn't know, and they unwittingly put their dog at risk. So supervise them, keep them out of the unsafe conditions. If it's questionable, keep them out. Again, choose the clearest, cleanest water possible for them, and especially when it comes to dogs, avoid that shallow, warm, stagnant water body. That's where you might have more of those benthic mats of cyanobacteria present, and if the dog kicks them up by wading in that water, you've got floating mats that they might then accidentally ingest. Always provide clean drinking water for them, and do whatever you can to prevent them from drinking untreated water, and especially eating floating material or material that's washed on shore, and that's going to be protective of them from all these other suites of things in addition to cyanotoxins. Wash them off with clean water after they're swimming too, because they will lick their coats and they could be exposed that way as well. And then one more bit about pets. Again, supervise pets. Keep them out of those unsafe conditions. We've dealt with dog deaths where the dog was just running around at a lake with a bloom, and people went out 20 minutes later and the dog's lying on the lawn, severely ill. So supervise them. But also recognize that there are other things. So water intoxication from ingesting too much water and heat stroke share some of the symptoms with cyanotoxin poisoning. So when the really worst symptoms are things like drooling, lethargy, up to seizures, and unfortunately death. So give your dog frequent breaks from playing in the water, just so they're not ingesting water constantly. Especially if you have a breed that's not a retrieving dog, use flat objects. They can close their mouth around it and minimize their water ingestion. And if your dog likes to bite at water that you're splashing up, say with a canoe paddle, keep those games short. Don't do it for hours because they will ingest a lot of water that way. To minimize the risks from heat stroke, provide shade access and clean, cool drinking water. And one last thing, if you live on a water body that has blooms and you irrigate your lawn, if your pets eat that grass, don't irrigate during a bloom. You're essentially bringing that bloom right up on the grass and serving it up to them. So that is the end of my slides. You can, this is my contact info. One thing you can do, so there's dnrhabs@wisconsin.gov email address. You can report blooms to us that way, and what is really useful is for photographs so we can verify what it is. Or questions or whatever. So, and I think we've got time for questions.
Yes. Questions from people here in person, and I'm going to look on the laptop and see if in the chat room there are some questions there as well.
All right.
So,
I think your hand was up first.
How are the cormorants affecting the water quality?
Question is, how are the cormorants affecting the water quality? I don't know specifically. I have been by islands in northern Lake Michigan around Beaver Island that are cormorant rookeries, and you can smell a lot of your from the droppings. So probably a lot of nutrients coming from those roosting areas, but I can't really give you anything that quantifies that.
I don't think anything good is coming from it.
The comment is he doesn't think anything good is coming from the cormorants.
Any way of reducing the population?
Any way of reducing the population, that is more for our wildlife staff, so I can't answer that for you, sorry. Okay, question over here, I'll get to you next.
We have clean, clear water right now, or at least clear water. The UVs are filtering down in and creating all this algae and everything. Where's this gonna be in 5 years?
Question is, we've got clear, clean water, you've got a lot of light penetration in Lake Michigan you're talking about specifically. Where are we gonna be in 5 years? That's a good question. A lot of that's going to depend Cladophora-wise on what the cycle of the lake water level is going to be. So if you've got those low levels, that's when you're going to have more of that near shore shelf is probably going to be more available for Cladophora and Cladophora habitat. If it's a high water, it won't be as bad. But I think at least in a lot of parts of northern Lake Michigan, you can't get any clearer than it is right now. It's super clear. Okay, you had a question over here? Someone did?
Yeah, you mentioned as one of the factors contributing to the problem, septic system leakage. Now, what I basically miss is I didn't hear anything mentioned as agricultural runoff, which is a major problem. From 5 to 1, and each of these bodies excrete about 18 times what a leading excrete. So my point here is that the untreated waste produced by these animals is about the size of a city of the population of Chicago. So I can contribute to that, but I think that's pretty well minimum compared with agricultural runoff. Would you like to comment on that?
Right, so the comment was about Kewaunee County and the amount of agricultural waste from CAFOs, basically, livestock waste that isn't applied on the land. And of course, you've got the karst bedrock too that allows a lot of the nutrients and et cetera to seep into the groundwater. So yeah, agriculture in most systems is going to be like the major contributor of nutrients to aquatic systems when you've got runoff that's bringing it in. There are different row crop methods that are being investigated by different agricultural groups. So things like no-till that are supposed to help to minimize runoff from agricultural fields. And I can't remember, he's spoken here before and I don't remember his name, but there is a Grassland 2.0 project. Someone is at UW-Madison, I think. You're nodding, Marcia. Do you remember his name? No. Okay, we don't remember his name, but yeah, as you have the right to. No, so Grassland 2.0 is sort of envisioning a future in which we transition a lot of row crop agriculture into grazing pasture lands, so you don't have basically CAFO type situations. The animals get to do their animal things, but everything's basically cycled right on these converted fields. But the reason I bring up the septic systems is in a lot of places in inland lakes, especially in northern Wisconsin, it is an issue. We've had there are some seepage lakes that you have really extreme water fluctuation. We've had a number of really rainy years, and in some of these lakes, the water levels are going up like 3 or 4 feet. And if you do have a lot of older septic systems on those lakes, that can be a really significant input via groundwater to those particular systems. You might not have agriculture around there. You might just have all forest and then some residences, et cetera. So in those systems, that will be an impact. But yeah, if you've got a system where you have a lot of agriculture in that, around that water body, it will impact it. So I mentioned when I was talking about the remote sensing, Beaver Dam Lake in Dodge County, there's a lot of row crop agriculture around there, and it's a shallow impoundment, and unfortunately they're dealing with a lot of that legacy phosphorus and sediment that has washed into that reservoir over decades.
Now, one more quick question. You mentioned that there was no funding, basically, to address it, if I understood you correctly. Does it mean there are no targeted efforts to tackle kind of high problem areas?
Question was about funding and are there targeted efforts for kind of high priority areas? Well, it's kind of talking about two different things. Just for monitoring for the purpose of beach safety, we don't have funding for that, even on our state properties. But when it comes to sort of tackling issues, that's where things like, so Michael brought up the impaired waters list. And that's sort of a mechanism. I mean, no one likes their waters being on the impaired waters list. Marcia, feel free to jump in if I get the details wrong, because I won't say why, but so getting on the impaired waters list, so DNR staff will do assessments of a water body. If they determine it's not meeting certain criteria, say if there's too much phosphorus over time that's been measured, then it goes on the impaired waters list. We report that to the US EPA. And then the US EPA turns around and says, okay, Wisconsin DNR, we recognize that you said this is on the impaired waters list. Now what are you going to do about it? And here's some money to start figuring out what the problem is. So yeah, it's bad to be on the impaired waters list, but it is also part of the mechanism to start addressing those issues. So we do get funding from the federal government for planning, and if you've got a really big system, you might go through a total maximum daily load project. So basically you look for all of the inputs of nutrients coming into that water body, and you figure out exactly how much is coming in. And then you use modeling to figure out how much do we have to reduce those inputs to reach our attained uses that we want. What's it going to take to reduce the phosphorus so we don't have algal blooms a certain percentage of the summer, or reduce the phosphorus level to a certain level. And so we have the modeling, and then after that, it's not DNR necessarily that implements the projects. You might have different agricultural groups. We work with UW Extension, County Land and Water groups. There are farmer-led groups who are trying to do different things that basically keep those nutrients on the land, and that's all part of that modeling process. But that implementation's not just done by DNR, it's done by many, many different partners, because it's a huge undertaking.
Yeah, the TMDL, I think it's a great tool, but I mean, try to address impaired waters, you have like a 9P element plan, right? I think the problem is, and correct me if I'm wrong, those are not enforceable. So,
do you mind if I just comment real quick?
Yes, Marcia will comment. She has been there and she's done this stuff.
Hi, my name's Marcia Wilhite. I have had a career with in water quality. A unique thing that Wisconsin does have that other states don't have. In general, when you're looking at pollution issues, the Clean Water Act and our state regulations do a really good job addressing discharges from point sources from wastewater treatment plants. But like you said, on the agricultural side, there's not the same requirements that are enforceable. We don't write permits for farm fields that limit the amount of pollution that comes off. There are requirements in place that set prohibitions and standards for example, land application of waste and that sort of thing. But like you said, the enforcement piece is the part that's really missing. It would be a challenge to enforce it. Talk about needing about a bunch of resources, that would certainly be it. But there is, in the part of Wisconsin regulations that deal with non-point source runoff, there is a unused requirement that if you have a TMDL in a particular watershed and the prohibitions and standards under NR 151, the non-point source runoff rules, are not sufficient to meet water quality standards, then if the legislature put it in place, there could be a requirement that farm fields meet those TMDL levels, which are designed to meet water quality standards. So that's future action that perhaps as citizens we could think about taking, is to advocate for implementing that requirement. So.
Thank you, Marcia. Oh, question in back here.
So after the algae blooms and dies off and water tends to clear up in the area, is it safe to go into them, or is there still a lot of contamination after it's died out?
Okay, the question is, after the algae has sort of died off and the water's cleared up, is it safe to go in? So are you talking about Cladophora or cyanobacteria, or both? Both. I don't really know about Cladophora. I'm guessing that you may have some residual bacteria, but I mean, if you don't have those giant mats on shore, if you're not swimming, I would hope you're not swimming among big clots of it out in the lake. But if you've had a big storm that obviously has moved it away, that it will be safer. But it's hard for me to state with certainty because you're not doing testing on it.
We've lived in two different areas. Winnebago, we've lived on, which is terrible. I mean, you get those algae blooms, it's awful because it smells really bad. And then it'll clear up, but you're never really sure.
Right.
Get up here on Lake Michigan, and you'll get a bloom. You have a bigger body of water, and things get more dispersed.
Right.
And looking at your graphs, I'm just talking out loud, wondering, the lower part of Green Bay, you had a lot more red and yellow and orange, and that water is coming up from Winnebago,
Right.
which at this time of the year can get very polluted.
Yeah, we're talking.
So is that contributing to lower Green Bay?
Yeah, so questions now about the blooms on Lake Winnebago. Yes, those are coming down the Fox River. So Dale Robertson at USGS has also been looking at whether there's actually algae growing in some spots of the Fox River as well, because it's pretty wide. In some places it's kind of sluggish, so it might be providing some habitat where you can actually have algae starting to grow in the Fox too. But there definitely seems to be a conduit from Lake Winnebago down the Fox into Lower Green Bay, and then of course you've got sort of the counterclockwise current patterns too that then bring that bloom from Lower Green Bay a little bit up the east shore of Green Bay. And as to the question about is it safer when it's dispersed? Dispersed, you can't see it as much in the water. It will be safer. I never offer anyone any absolutes that it's safe, because I can't tell unless I'm actually testing for those toxins. If you can't see it, it'll be safer. But again, the safest thing that you can do is not to swallow the water, because that's how you're going to get sick. If you're swimming and swallowing the water accidentally and it looks really clear, it's not obviously not going to be as bad as if you have a lot of algae in the water, but I can never really offer people absolutes. What question?
I think you mentioned earlier that there was no funding for actually monitoring the, let's say, the shoreline of Door Peninsula. Is anybody monitoring the shore of the
Question about monitoring the shoreline. So are you talking about for cyanobacterial toxins? Because there is US EPA Beach Act money that is used for the bacteria monitoring. So E. coli bacteria at Great Lakes beaches. So that's some of the stuff that Michael Barkey was talking about earlier. So it's my understanding. So I'll admit this. So one of the other hats that's been bestowed upon me at DNR is as Inland Beach Monitoring Coordinator. I work with a colleague in our Office of Great Waters who coordinates the Great Lakes beaches. I don't know all of the ins and outs, but my understanding is that there's federal funding for E. coli bacteria testing at Great Lakes beaches. So some of that money goes to Greg Kleinheinz at UW Oshkosh. He has students who are going out and collecting samples at the beaches. That federal money is, I think it goes from the feds to DNR, then to Greg, and that's how your beach testing gets done here. And then there's other things like the signs too, I think, that are coming from some of the Beach Act funding. Mike has clarification.
I think just to add to that sort of equation, I believe it also goes through here, Door County Health Department.
Yes.
Coming down through all the way down to the Kleinheinz and his program.
Okay. Mike clarified that the money is also coming through Door County Health Department too. There's a lot of pieces, but the bacteria funding is coming from, the E. coli bacteria funding is coming from the the feds basically. US EPA has money for, under the Clean Water Act, under what is called the Beach Act, for testing coastal beaches. We don't have that money, however, for inland beaches. So we have a little pot of money that DNR has for doing all of our water quality testing through our Wisconsin State Laboratory of Hygiene. We have that for some inland lakes that are monitored by local health departments, but it doesn't cover the whole state. But then when it comes to looking for cyanobacteria toxins at beaches, the amount is zero. There are some local health agencies that do their own testing. I don't know where their funding comes from. So, for example, in Madison, the Dane County, Public Health Madison, Dane County. So it's sort of combined city and county health department. They have funding for interns to go collect samples. They have in-house processing. They look at what cyanobacteria are at the beaches. They test for some of the toxins. They have their own funding for that, but we don't have anything to do that in either Great Lakes beaches or inland beaches at all. Question at the back.
It wouldn't take any funding to eliminate some of that bacteria. There are sportsmen's clubs up on Washington Island begging that something be done about the cormorants. There's cormorants, thousands and thousands of them. We have them right in front of our house every day. More and more every year. I've lived there for 71 years. I've seen beaches destroyed by cormorants. It wouldn't take any funding to eliminate them. The sportsmen would gladly take care of it. Has anybody ever proposed any common sense solutions to this?
Questions about common sense solutions for addressing the cormorant issues, especially on Washington Island, and
I couldn't hear you.
especially on Washington Island. So addressing the cormorant issues, I can't really speak to that. That's beyond my scope at the DNR.
I understand it. The problem is the lack of common sense. Some of this stuff is solvable. Without studies, without years and years of studies, it could be solved within a week. And it's not done.
It might be solved within a week, but I think you probably have different federal regulations, such as the Migratory Bird Act, that you would have to deal with.
Absolutely correct. And the federal government will step in and stop it. That's the problem.
Right.
It's just like the wolves, it's the same thing. But it could be resolved. A lot of this stuff could be taken care of locally and very easily.
Thanks for your comment.
Gina, I have something to back up before we got on to this particular issue, and that was, I guess, about cover crops and rotating crops and so on. We have a speaker coming the end of this month, I believe it's on the 28th. His name is Nate Lawrence. He's with the Savannah Institute in Madison, and he's going to speak about agroforestry, I think is the title part of his presentation, to discuss how these farming techniques perhaps can reduce the nutrients that are running off the agricultural land and into streams and things. So that's coming up on the 28th.
Okay, thanks. We're moving into mushrooms now. We're turning into mushrooms.
All right. Well, it's about 8:30, and I know we started late, and I really appreciate everyone's patience. I don't know what kind of response we got online. I looked at the questions, most of them were they were having trouble with the volume, the sound.
Oh.
So I'm hoping that we have a good recording, and we can match that up and crank up the volume, and we'll put that on our DCEC YouTube channel, and we'll also put the link on our DCEC website. That's, I think, the best we can do at this point. So I want to thank everybody for coming out this evening and your patience for staying here. And I want to thank Gina and Marcia and people in the audience for asking the questions that you have. And I guess that's about it. So and we'd like to thank Gina for the presentation.